the sky above Europe erupted into chaos. February 1944 witnessed something unprecedented. Over 1,000 American bombers blackened the heavens in broad daylight. They flew straight into Germany's most deadly defenses. What many called madness became the moment that shattered the mighty Luftwaffe forever. A single week changed everything. The fate of the war hung in the balance. Smoke columns twisted skyward like dark monuments to destruction. Thunder rolled across German soil as explosions shook the earth. Citizens below craned their necks upward in terror and amazement. Massive bomber formations stretched endlessly across the horizon. The pale winter sun disappeared behind wings and fuselages. Engines roared in perfect unison. This mechanical symphony of power announced America's arrival in force. The 8th Air Force had unleashed its fury. Each bomber bristled with defensive guns. Death filled their bomb bays. Destruction was their cargo. German anti-aircraft guns responded with desperate violence. Black bursts of flak bloomed like poisonous flowers throughout the sky. Flying fortresses and liberators shuddered under the impacts. Metal skins split open. Flames danced through compartments. Still the formations pressed forward without wavering. These airborne fortresses advanced into hell itself with unwavering determination. German fighters swarmed around them like angry hornets. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs slashed through the bomber streams. Their attacks were savage and relentless. Tracer bullets streaked past like falling stars. Cockpits burst into orange fireballs. White parachutes drifted down through the carnage. This was no ordinary combat. The battle raged with apocalyptic intensity. For Germany's Air Force, this week marked the beginning of their end. For America, it tested whether industrial might could overwhelm experienced defenders. The clash was absolute. The stakes were enormous. This single week would determine who ruled the skies over Europe. But what brought the war to this decisive moment? How did 1,000 bombers come to risk everything against the world's most feared air force? The answer lies in the years before the storm broke. Long before the February thunder, the aerial war was already a contest of competing philosophies. Germany had built its entire war machine around air superiority. The Luftwaffe emerged as Hermann Göring's greatest creation. Their strategy was elegantly brutal. Speed combined with precision. The decisive blow delivered without mercy. Blitzkrieg meant more than tanks racing across frontiers. Stuka dive bombers screamed down on helpless columns. Messerschmitt fighters swept enemy aircraft from the skies. Level bombers softened targets for ground invasion. This formula devastated Poland completely. France fell in weeks. Britain trembled under the onslaught. For a brief moment, German eagles seemed destined to rule the skies forever. Yet warfare never remains static. The Battle of Britain proved even Göring's squadrons could be defeated. British radar pierced through German deception. Royal Air Force pilots fought with desperate courage. A nation under siege found the strength to resist. Germany adapted to this setback. Their factories worked around the clock. More fighters rolled off production lines. Designs improved with each iteration. The long war Hitler envisioned demanded continuous preparation. Every engine represented hope for renewed dominance. Every aircraft carried the dream of reclaimed supremacy. Across the Atlantic, another giant stirred to life. America entered the war with radically different ideas. While Britain relied on nighttime bombing to minimize losses, Americans insisted on daylight precision strikes. Their generals believed heavily armed bombers could survive in daylight. Tight formations would provide mutual protection. Overwhelming production would compensate for losses. They planned to strike the Reich's vital organs directly. factories, fuel depots, steel mills, all would fall under American bombs. Critics called this approach suicidal madness. How could lumbering bombers survive without darkness for protection? American confidence sprang from their industrial capacity. Numbers would overcome skill. Overwhelming force would bend the impossible into reality. Behind this doctrinal clash lay treaties that had tried to prevent such warfare. The Washington Naval Treaty limited warship construction. But nothing contained the arms race in the skies. As Europe burned, aviation technology advanced unchecked. Engines grew more powerful each year. Weapons became increasingly deadly. Aircraft designs pushed boundaries of size and speed. Every innovation responded to fear. Fear of falling behind. Fear of losing the technological race. Fear of defeat. By 1943, the strategic situation crystallized. Germany could not be conquered from the ground while its air force remained intact. Tanks and infantry mattered little if enemy bombers roamed freely overhead. Americans understood this reality clearly. The British grasped it equally well. Together, they conceived a plan that went beyond harassment raids. They would force the Luftwaffe into open battle. They would bleed it of experienced pilots. They would shatter its ability to defend the Reich. This was the conceptual birth of Big Week. Not a campaign born from chance encounters, but the result of years of planning, years of doctrinal development, years of cold calculation about total war. Germany still believed their fighters could hold the defensive line. Americans believed numbers combined with daylight steel could smash through any defense. Two competing visions of air power prepared for collision. February 1944 would reveal which philosophy would determine Europe's fate. The path to Big Week stretched back through years of innovation and sacrifice. For America, entering the war meant one overwhelming priority: production at unprecedented scale. Factories that once manufactured automobiles transformed into aircraft assembly plants. Assembly lines that produced refrigerators now built bomber frames. Civilian goods vanished from production schedules. War materials took their place. Steel, aluminum, and human sweat merged into wings spanning wider than city blocks. Fuselages stretched longer than freight trains. Each aircraft represented more than engineering achievement. They symbolized national determination, translated into physical form. The B-17 Flying Fortress stood at the center of this transformation. Massive and bristling with machine guns, she was designed to absorb punishment that would destroy lesser aircraft. The B-24 Liberator followed with greater speed and extended range. Together, they became the hammers of American daylight bombing doctrine. Even the mightiest hammers require protection. That protection arrived in the elegant form of the P-51 Mustang. This fighter emerged from Anglo-American cooperation. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine perfected its performance. Suddenly, daylight raids possessed wings capable of reaching Berlin itself. The dream of deep penetration bombing gained realistic foundation. For the young men who would fly these machines, training was relentlessly demanding. Recent graduates barely out of civilian life endured brutal preparation. They learned to trust their formations absolutely. They practiced holding steady while flak burst around them. They trained to fire without hesitation when enemy fighters attacked. Each crew developed into a tight brotherhood. Survival depended on discipline as much as on equipment. In barracks and hangars, nervous laughter masked underlying terror. Every airman understood the risks involved. Every man also recognized the mission's importance exceeded his individual survival. Across the ocean, German factories maintained their own feverish pace. the Luftwaffe produced streams of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s. Heavy twin-engine Me Ford-on-10s joined the defensive fleet. Yet each new machine consumed resources the Reich could barely afford. Pilot training accelerated out of necessity. Young aviators entered combat with minimal experience compared to earlier standards. The war of attrition had already begun, though few acknowledged this reality openly. The contrast between opposing production systems was stark. American assembly lines flowed like mighty rivers. Thousands of aircraft emerged monthly. German production struggled against increasing shortages. Allied bombing campaigns targeted the very factories sustaining the Luftwaffe. This became a race not merely of technology, but of endurance itself. In that contest, America was pulling steadily ahead. Numbers alone could not guarantee victory, however. Strategic planners understood this fundamental truth. Breaking Germany from the air required a decisive, concentrated blow. Not scattered raids or symbolic gestures, but focused and merciless assault. Operation Argument would test whether American bombers could survive daylight combat. It would prove whether Mustang fighters could truly protect them. Most importantly, it would determine whether the Luftwaffe could withstand industrial-scale warfare. This was more than military planning. It represented the culmination of years of design, training, and faith in mechanical superiority. Every flying fortress emerging from factories pointed toward one specific week. February 1944 would provide the ultimate test. When that moment arrived, there would be no retreat possible. Early missions before Big Week served as deadly rehearsals. Small formations of B-17s and B-24s probed deep into German territory. They tested their strength against experienced defenders. Losses mounted steadily. Entire squadrons failed to return from missions. Crews whispered about friends who had vanished into smoke clouds. The lesson became painfully clear. Daylight bombing required fundamental changes to survive. Those changes were materializing in the form of long-range escort fighters. By winter 1944, English airfields hummed with restless energy. Snow and mud clung to everything. Bitter winds cut across runways without mercy. Great machines waited in patient rows. Flying fortresses stood like armored beasts. Their silver skins gleamed dully under pale skies. Ground crews swarmed around each bomber. Bolts were tightened to perfection. Ammunition belts fed into gun positions, bombs stacked in neat rows, their surfaces gleaming with cold menace. Engines coughed and roared during testing. Exhaust clouds billowed into frozen air. The sound created a drumbeat of anticipation. It echoed across the English countryside for miles. Inside barracks, tension hung heavy as fog. Young men sat on narrow bunks. Some read letters from home repeatedly. Others stared at floors in thoughtful silence. They joked loudly to mask their fear. Cigarettes were shared freely. They tried not to contemplate what awaited them. Every mission carried the possibility of fiery death. Big Week promised something far greater and more dangerous. An assault so massive it could cripple the Luftwaffe permanently. The thought inspired both dread and fierce pride. They would participate in history, one way or another. Briefings took place in dimly lit halls. Maps spread across wooden tables. Lines drawn in red and blue marked flight paths and targets. Officers explained objectives methodically. Factories at Augsburg, Regensburg, Leipzig. The names carved themselves into crew memories, symbols of approaching danger and potential destiny. Flight paths, rendezvous points, emergency procedures. All were memorized with desperate attention. But one truth lingered above all others. Many seats would remain empty after the mission. Silence followed each briefing session. No one needed to voice the obvious. The mathematics of aerial warfare were brutal and unforgiving. The Luftwaffe prepared with equal intensity. On airfields scattered throughout Germany, mechanics worked through bitter cold nights. Messerschmitts received fuel and ammunition. Cannons were loaded with deadly precision. Pilots received their own briefings about the approaching storm. These men understood what was coming clearly. The Americans would not stop until forced to stop. For German pilots, this was no longer about maintaining dominance. This was about survival itself. Each mission represented a battle to keep the Reich alive one more day. The stage was set with terrible precision. 1,000 bombers would rise together. Fighters would escort them across hostile skies. They would carry the thunder of American industry into Germany's heartland. Every participant understood the stakes completely. Every man felt the weight of impending history. Training was finished. Preparation was complete. The march toward Big Week had begun. The journey into the heart of the storm awaited. February 20th, 1944, dawned with cold, pale light creeping across English airfields. Engines thundered to life as crews climbed aboard their stations. From runway after runway, bombers lifted into formation. One after another, they climbed skyward. The formations grew until wings seemed to cover the sky itself. Not dozens of aircraft, not hundreds. More than 1,000 bombers darkened the horizon. From the ground below, English villagers stared upward in amazement. The roar shook windows throughout the countryside. The sky itself trembled with accumulated power. The greatest air armada in history was departing for Germany. Crossing the North Sea, condensation trails marked their passage. These ghostly scars stretched across the sky for miles. Inside the aircraft, men sat in tense silence, oxygen masks pressed against frost-covered faces. Glass and steel accumulated ice crystals. The bombers droned forward steadily. Engines maintained their pounding rhythm without variation. Each crew understood what lay ahead. Flak, fighters, death. Still they pressed onward without hesitation. Near Leipzig, the Luftwaffe struck with desperate fury. From above and below, swarms of German fighters dove into the formations. Messerschmitt, Bf-109s, and Focke-Wulf 190s attacked like wolves among sheep. Tracer fire lanced through morning air. Red and green streaks slashed across the sky. Bombers shuddered as cannon shells ripped into their frames. Wings tore apart under the impact. Engines burst into flames. White parachutes blossomed like flowers throughout the chaos. Each parachute represented a fragile life cast into the maelstrom. Inside the tight formations, gunners fired back desperately. The air filled with the rattle of 50-caliber machine guns. Engines screamed under strain. Metal twisted and tore. The sky transformed into a furnace of steel and fire. German pilots hurled themselves repeatedly at the fortress formations. They fought against time and overwhelming numbers. For every bomber they destroyed, more surged forward relentlessly. Then the Mustangs arrived like avenging angels. Sleek, fast, deadly P-51s tore into German ranks. They dove from the sun with ruthless precision. In moments, hunters became the hunted. Dogfights spiraled across the heavens above. Contrails wove into knots of life and death. The once invincible Luftwaffe found itself bleeding pilots and aircraft. On the ground below, factory workers in Augsburg and Regensburg watched in growing terror. The bombers approached like a mechanical plague. Air raid sirens wailed their warnings. Bay doors opened with mechanical precision. Thousands of bombs tumbled downward through the sky. They whistled through air before exploding in sheets of flame. Entire industrial complexes vanished under smoke and destruction. Workshops reduced to rubble in seconds. Precision machinery twisted into useless wreckage. Each detonation represented more than physical destruction. It was the systematic collapse of Germany's aerial future. Day after day, the storm returned with mechanical regularity. February 21st, 22nd, 23rd, 24th. Every dawn brought another devastating wave. Stuttgart, Gotha, Brunswick felt the hammer blows repeatedly. German defenses grew progressively thinner. Experienced pilots became increasingly scarce. Ammunition supplies dwindled dangerously. Every mission drained the Luftwaffe further. Meanwhile, Americans continued rising in unstoppable numbers. The week became an unending nightmare, a grinding slaughter that stripped Germany of its aerial shield. By the final day, the evidence was undeniable. The Luftwaffe could not match this scale of assault. They could not replace their mounting losses. They could not stop this industrial tide. The skies above the Reich had become a graveyard. Twisted wreckage and smoke marked countless crash sites. Ace pilots who had carved legendary names disappeared forever. Boys with minimal flight training replaced them. The balance of aerial power had shifted permanently and irrevocably. This was Big Week's true meaning. A battle measured not only in sorties and losses. This represented the breaking of will itself. For Germany, it marked the moment their eagle's wings were torn away. For the Allies, it proved daylight bombing could crush enemies at their core. The gamble had been enormous. The price was staggering beyond calculation. But the result was absolutely undeniable. The Luftwaffe, once Europe's terror, had been forced to its knees. The road to aerial victory stretched open before Allied forces. When Big Week's echoes finally faded, the scale of sacrifice was staggering. For the United States Army Air Forces, over 200 bombers never returned to English bases. Thousands of airmen were lost forever, burned, captured, or vanished in frozen skies above. English airfields were marked by empty spaces. Great silver machines would never land in those spots again. Surviving crews mourned friends in painful silence. Letters to families could never fill the devastating void. The cost was terrible beyond measure. But the mission had not been sacrificed in vain. For the Luftwaffe, the wound proved mortal. In just 6 days of combat, nearly 600 aircraft were destroyed completely. Far worse was the loss of experienced pilots. Aces who had survived years of aerial combat were gone, consumed by the storm of American steel. These men could never be replaced adequately. Training new pilots required months or years. The Reich no longer possessed such time. Factories lay in shattered ruins. Production capabilities were crippled permanently. The skies above Germany no longer belonged to its defenders. The Luftwaffe's eagle had been broken beyond repair. In Berlin, propaganda ministers tried desperately to mask the truth. They called the raids costly but inconclusive. Inside the Reich Air Ministry, however, fear ran deep. Reports spoke of declining morale throughout the force. Critical shortages affected every aspect of operations. Defenses were stretched impossibly thin. The myth of German invincibility had cracked wide open. For the first time, German civilians looked skyward and saw vulnerability instead of protection. The war that had seemed distant was now falling directly upon their homes and cities. Across the English Channel, Allied commanders took careful stock of results. The press called it a week of hell for Hitler's Air Force. Military leaders understood the meaning ran far deeper. Big Week was not merely another series of bombing raids. It represented the decisive turning point of aerial warfare. It proved daylight bombing could succeed against any defense. It demonstrated the Mustang's dominance in fighter combat. Most importantly, it showed the Luftwaffe could be dragged into battle and beaten decisively. This was the harbinger of everything to come. Every bomb dropped carried a clear message. Every life lost proclaimed an undeniable truth. The Reich was no longer untouchable from above. Air superiority over Europe had changed hands permanently. With that shift, the path to invasion opened wide. The long-dreamed assault on Hitler's fortress Europe was finally possible. Big Week's legacy reached far beyond the immediate smoke and ashes. For the Luftwaffe, it marked the irreversible breaking point. Never again would Germany's Air Force challenge Allied forces with comparable strength. From February 1944 onward, their decline was relentless and unstoppable. Once feared squadrons were reduced to mere shadows. Factories could theoretically be rebuilt with time and resources. Aircraft could potentially be produced in new locations, but the experienced pilots who had fallen could never be replaced. Their knowledge, skill, and combat experience died with them. The skies over Europe had shifted irrevocably into Allied hands. For the United States and its allies, Big Week provided complete vindication. It proved daylight precision bombing was not only possible but decisive. The strategy that had seemed recklessly suicidal was now revealed as the key to victory. Sending great bombers into Germany's heart had broken enemy resistance. The P-51 Mustang emerged as more than just another fighter aircraft. It became a symbol of aerial dominance. Its long range and superior speed had redefined air warfare completely. The combination of fortress bombers and escort fighters had broken the Luftwaffe's back. From this moment forward, the road to D-Day lay clear and open. In the months that followed Big Week, Allied bombing campaigns grew ever more destructive. Oil refineries became primary targets. Synthetic fuel plants were pounded day after day without mercy. Railway networks were systematically destroyed. Without fuel, German tanks stalled on battlefields. Without functioning railways, supplies could not reach the front lines. Without air cover, the Reich stood naked before advancing Allied forces. Big Week had not ended the war immediately, but it had opened the door wide to the war's end. Future historians would mark this as the moment the balance tipped decisively. For some, it represented the death of the Luftwaffe. For others, it was the triumph of industrial capacity over military tradition. Perhaps the deepest lesson was simpler and more fundamental. In modern warfare, mastery of the skies was not won by courage alone. Neither was it achieved by superior machines in isolation. Victory required the relentless weight of production, strategy, and time. The skies of Europe, once dominated by Germany's Black Cross, now echoed with the roar of Allied engines. As the wreckage of that devastating week sank into Reich soil, it carried a truth that would echo through history. The future was not decided by the sharp talons of the Luftwaffe. It was determined by the iron wings of 1,000 bombers, and by the unwavering resolve of those who sent them into the storm.